Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. It's difficult to uh, describe or investigate a subject, investigate and describe, which requires a lot of quantitative and qualitative analysis. And those of you who work with images and of this type of materials, you know, it's definitely it's not easy talk. It's not easy journey. I'll be relatively brief. There's a paper available, a draft of a paper. So those who need to please request it. But I'll just highlight most important points about memes and buzzwords which used historically or used today to describe label rather women in power. I don't think I have to need to explain what memes are and discuss lots of theory, but basically, two pictures right there shows just as one is quite a famous or infamous in China. It's a meme. It's Winnie the Pooh. Has been historically for 10 years now associated with President Xi. Apparently banned in China because of the mockery that people think associated with this meme. And also one of the most famous memes, just which associate with almost all women who are successful and powerful in this world, has been and are. So definitely one of the important points we discussed, and I would try to pursue, is to uh, uh, see how expectations about what role women supposed to play in business and politics, expectations which are codified or exist in mores and customs and norms, ideology, religion, and other variables just we can measure or describe how these expectations are violated, and this is again or somehow distorted, and the distortion of expectations, what is expected, what is prescribed, what is supposed to be, those expectations violated, so they become source fuel for character attacks. Well, a very simple procedure, but let's see, those who work with these numbers, this data, understand this how difficult it is. Well, we took a sample. The list is relatively short of all women in position of president, prime minister since 1970. Why 70? Well, just we need to stop somewhere because not so many before that, and we didn't go that far. And we collected about 3,000 plus of memes, caricatures, posters, and similar images. And definitely we had to limit ourselves because some names were associated with just few of memes, other names definitely with thousands and thousands. And that's one of the challenges, methodological. Where did you stop? And how do you compare a person who was known for 2 years being prime minister and just only one caricature available to today's web? Things like this one, it's we didn't count because it's a positive image. Yes, Trump is being chased by a witch, but sort of a good witch, right? So just not mockery. Actually, just I don't think there's any element of character attack or character mockery, or these individuals. Basically, this is political criticism. So historically, we look at character attacks as attacks on character, not necessarily policies. If you say, well, your policy is wrong, it's not character attack. And this is a picture from Romania. It's a famous, well, she is famous, President Sandu there. And yes, she's criticized for her policies, basically. And this is something we didn't count because it's will not be representative of database we have. And so that's why I put red dots. We didn't count those. So difficult content analysis. Once again, so you use referees, and referees make subjective judgments about what's considered to be in this category or that category. And I described this in the paper. 3 basic themes appeared of criticism or actually meme creation based on these violations or deviations from norms, expectations. So alleged emasculation and violation of traditional femininity. Second, alleged promiscuity and over-sexuality. And third, lack of intelligence. So examples, I give it to you. Once again, examples. In fact, I use some examples from contemporary politics because we added a list of classical list of prime ministers, presidents, also contemporary figures. So masculinization, basically, just examples. Well, showing that a character has masculine traits, risky behavior, hostile actions, violence. Let's see, Prime Minister of Italy, Melanie, position as El Duce, Benito Mussolini. So the classical characterization of Margaret Thatcher in Britain. So it's a massive number of caricatures and memes just showing her as a bloodthirsty bodybuilder in so many ways. So more contemporary political leaders and label of Iron Ladies, not only attached to Margaret Thatcher, but other leaders as a leader of one of the Baltic states, Latvia, or contemporary individuals. I use those example of Sarah Palin, just one of the most infamous or famous subjects of character attacks, and others. As a picture of Margaret Merkel. We consider this action of drinking beer, just a big mug right there, as something which we refer to mockery and a display of quote unquote excessive masculinity. Second, promiscuity over sexuality. Not many, but again, quantitatively speaking, but quite prominent feature. I use just examples of, and I use example of Sarah Palin because she's a champion of such attacks, has been and remains on the web. Also can show examples on top. You see it's a former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko, right there. It's just, well, and on the bottom you see Prime Minister of Finland, ex-Prime Minister of Finland, some Marine, and alleged, well, actually, things that happened, so her excessive, quote unquote, partying behavior being Prime Minister right there. So alleged excessive sexuality. And also alleged lack of intelligence. When I'm saying it's alleged because, well, to claim lack of intelligence, you have to measure intelligence, but nobody gets to measure. But alleged, easiest examples. Can we use contemporary politics? One of the targets has been is it's Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Cortez. Is a president. She is a congresswoman from New York. And so give examples of such memes, comparing her to a variety of creatures and also posters and pictures which allege her lack of intelligence. Second type of studies conducted is one of those I want to show. It's more specific, more detailed analysis of individuals based on referee judgments. So we chose, well, perhaps now it's history, case of 6 women, which were prominent 10 years ago, basically, but especially some of them were more prominent than they are today, then acting and now former politicians. You see from Sarah Palin. Michelle Obama is not a politician, but First Lady's public figure. And not many of you remember the name of Christine O'Donnell, running for U.S. Senate, and definitely you know 3 ladies in the, here, Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, and Nancy Pelosi. And the sort of experiments, basically it's just judgment calls of subjects who would assess photographs and features and just rank certain characteristics, and then just we analyze them and put them in categories. Once again, just if you ask about statistical analysis, yes, I will be happy to show you, but basically it's a combination of a quantitative, qualitative analysis. So 5 hypotheses were tested, again, introduced by our graduate students who did this research, suggesting that attacks on women, specific attacks, fall into 5 major categories. And I put it right there: good-looking and powerful women labeled as whores. Older women in position of power tend to be portrayed as witches. Average looking, and we measure just subjective call about how you see the person, really beautiful, not necessarily old. Yes, it's just, maybe it's impolite, it's incorrect, but people make those judgments all the time. Average looking but really powerful women tend to be, well, it's a B word, and I think I can say it, right? Can I say it? Microphones here. And also good looking and dismissed as dumb blondes, and women appear ambitious, hysterics. Basically, it's just appearing to hysterical tendencies of showing off. So overall, it's fifth hypothesis didn't find support. Four of them just found from moderate to I'll say moderate support, empirical support. I wouldn't say it was success, but at least we found some statistical differences in the way people portray these particular women. And this is again sort of a diagram we put together right there just to show how this distributed. So an attractive, less powerful, powerful. It's based on judgments, how subjects assess these individuals' power, attractiveness, and their actions. So, and one of the analysis, which is quite interesting, it's analysis of fairy tales and memes that appear there. Overwhelming majority of memes used in fairy tales refer to men. Just easiest to Dracula or images of pirates, big bad wolf, the most common memes used to attach to male politicians. For women, the most powerful image is a witch. Has been, is, and there is no particular reason why it's an image attached. Definitely to see it's molded older women, so people of age, basically. But the image of which has been historically most common, and I use examples here, is Nancy Pelosi to Indira Gandhi, if you remember, was a very powerful Prime Minister of India for a number of years. Yes. So it's still work in progress. It's still a challenge to find empirical evidence to apparently common sense hypothesis, but so many things that appear commonsensical didn't find empirical support. But we believe that we're on the right track, and so with the use of more advanced methods of content analysis, we think we can establish categories with more empirical support. So basically, overall, it's a challenge to traditional rules is being used as a fuel for character attacks, and most attacks try to portray women as shrill, flaky, or basically unlikable. So for voters or general audience to make their judgment call. Thank you so much. I think I just I'm on time. I'll just yeah, you got a PowerPoint ready?
Yes. Next up, Jennifer Keohane.
Thanks, Martijn. Thank you all. One of the things, as Hendrik mentioned last night, that we were thinking about is kind of the foreign policy perspective and attacks on women in power, and how sort of a global information system has facilitated these attacks. I'm a rhetorical critic by training, and to think a little bit about powerful women, and particularly powerful women within the foreign policy space, I decided to zero my presentation in on Condoleezza Rice, who Eric mentioned briefly here. Now, I know for the students in the room, you actually may not have been alive when Condoleezza Rice was doing her thing, but she was voted the most powerful woman in the world for 2 years in a row during her tenure as Secretary of State. And here you can see she beat out 99 female heads of state, chief executives, and celebrities to top this list. But in the course of her role as Secretary of State, she was characterized as an inspiration to all women. She was also characterized as the devil's handmaiden, a sellout as well, which I think points to some of the challenges of Black conservatism sort of writ large, and even actually a race traitor. And you can see some of that emerging from this particular essay. Also, as I was doing research, was reminded of this viral video, to the extent that videos went viral in like 2006. But this was a song called Condilicious, sung to the tune of Fergalicious. If you don't know what Fergalicious is, bless you, you clearly weren't in college in the early aughts. But as you can see from the lyric that I've quoted down at the bottom, it questions her sexuality, her relationship with President Bush. But this was a very, Google it if you, it's a very, very strange. You will feel uncomfortable watching it. So my study sort of goes beyond and builds upon previous studies in order to interrogate how Rice's representation in political cartoons specifically function as character attacks. So quickly to situate this in the literature, Rice has been recognized in scholarship for her importance in shaping foreign policy and in the debates that her role as Secretary of State spurred and inspired about race and gender in the United States in the early 2000s. She was the provost at Stanford before she entered politics, and her role there was, again, incredibly controversial, marked by aggressive leadership decisions that were often made unilaterally. And Rice was enormously influential in laying out what's now called the Bush Doctrine and sketching our foreign policy in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And again, many of the choices that she made were controversial, but certainly known for muscular, aggressive foreign policy that supports unilateral action and often flies in the face of assumptions, which, to be clear, are just that, assumptions, that women are predestined to be peacemakers when they enter the international stage. One study of a narrative about her life shows that she illustrates the liminality of Black women in a way that unmakes claims about post-race or a colorblind America that were emerging in the early 2000s. Now, I will say, I think those of us who live in the United States in the 2020s recognize all of those as quite myths, and we don't live in a colorblind society, clearly, and I'm not starting from that place in my study. I recognize the influence of race, as you'll see in a second. Folks have also studied her rhetorical strategies in framing her own personal story, again, in relation to debates about race in the early 2000s. Despite her importance, though, I was surprised as I started this study to find her rhetoric relatively uncovered in the field. Now, of course, we have studied as a CARP lab, and many of you lovely folks in this room have studied as well, the gendering of female politicians and the gendering and racializing of character attacks, which Dr. Shiraev just gave us a good overview of as well. And so tropes of gender and race are certainly intertwined. We did a study on attacks on Kamala Harris as vice president and found tropes of the angry Black woman rising to the fore in the media coverage that we looked at. And that, I think, leads us to the note that when gender and race combine, we can draw from the work of folks like Patricia Hill Collins to look specifically at the representations, not just of women in general, but of Black women, where we get some tropes that interlap or overlap with and intertwine with some of the things that Eric mentioned earlier. But when we talk about Black women, we tend to get things like the Jezebel, the dangerous, oversexed Black woman, the mammy, who's the caretaker, who supports white masculinity as motherly and has no interest in upending the status quo, or the matriarch, who's the domineering emasculator, especially of white men. Now, last thing to note quickly is just, of course, the preponderance of political cartoons in launching character attacks. We wrote about this one in the textbook. This is a cartoon from 1980 that is playing on the Jimmy Carter attacking rabbit story. We write about that in the book on page 99 if you don't know what this story is. But clearly, as we can see in this cartoon, it's playing up the tropes of Jimmy Carter as an incompetent hick. And political cartoons are good that way, right? And playing up archetypes of characters. It's very easy to tell who the enemies are and who the heroes are when it comes to political cartoons. Now, I will say, we also need to recognize that political cartoons have a long history of racist, anti-Semitic exaggerations when it comes to visual representations of other people. And we're going to see some of that in a second here. I will say, too, of course, rhetorical critics like Janice Edwards have recognized the power of political cartoons in politics, especially in playing up issues of gender. And Eric talked a little bit about this as well. It's worth noting, I think, that many political cartoonists are men, which is something that is only starting to change very, very slowly here. So again, as we've argued, political cartoons are a key arena where character attacks evolve. And I will say any study that exists, there are like two, that study representations of Condoleezza Rice mention political cartoons, because the political cartoons that showed her were so incredibly prominent and quite vicious, if I had to say. I don't know how much historical context I need to give you, although rhetorical critics are adamant and right that discourse emerges out of particular historical, social, and geopolitical contexts. But it's worth noting, I think, that foreign policy in the early 2000s was an old boys club, still largely is. Colin Powell was Rice's predecessor as Secretary of State and the first Black man to hold that role. Rice served as National Security Advisor, the first Black woman in that role, before she became the Secretary of State. And these were the first appointments actually announced by George W. Bush after he was declared the winner of the incredibly contentious 2000 election. And this was done, these appointments were announced in order to blunt criticism of the whiteness of the Republican Party. And there's a larger discussion to be had about the role of Black conservatives and the conservative worldview, but I'm going to skip that for now. The other thing that's important to note that's happening at this time is the US begins its foray into the Middle East. Rice had very close personal relationships with the president, and a lot of her arguments make her way into the Bush doctrine. Fundamentally, Rice seeks to balance the US's national interest, very much putting the US first, with the central value of spreading democracy, often with unilateral action as well. I want to really quickly say something about method, which is that studying political cartoons is really hard. It's hard because humor is complex, but it's also hard because it's very challenging to gather a large data set when it comes to political cartoons, because there's nowhere to go to do it, right? There's no one database of political cartoons that you can just search. And even databases like LexisNexis say that you can sort by political cartoons, but you really can't. So when you're studying political cartoons, you're sort of gathering the best you can from secondary scholarship, Google, and that kind of thing. I chose to include international publications in my data set as well, but I'll just say that studying political cartoons is hard. And every time I agree to do it, I'm like, why did I do this? But let me tell you a little bit about what I found when I looked at the cartoons about Condoleezza Rice. Some of these themes echo a little bit about what Eric said before. She's often represented as an animal, a parrot or a bird in particular. We often see her surrounded by markers of domesticity. We see her in sexualized roles, although I will say the secondary scholarship makes a great deal of these sexualized roles, and I did not find them to be as prominent as it seems like folks said that they were. We see her portrayed as a child, and then we see, and I think there's something to be said about general image caricatures that do, I think, point to, in some ways subtle and in some ways actually really quite overt racism. So let me show you some examples and then I'll point to some conclusions. Here we see her as a parrot, echoing back what George Bush says. You're also going to learn a lot about George Bush by looking at these cartoons as well. She's repeating back to him. So again, we're seeing it, the idea of her incompetence, her inability to hold her own thought in relationship to what Eric said earlier. And also, because she had a close personal relationship with George Bush, we see that questioned and recirculated in these cartoons as well. Here she is as a dove, not quite the same thing, but nonetheless, pointing to her slyness, which is also a trope about women working in foreign policy. Again, markers of domesticity we see in these cartoons a lot. We see her wearing an apron. We see her cooking. And I will say it's worth noting, of course, that she's not the only person in the kitchen in this cartoon. We see Bush, Rumsfeld, and Cheney as well. But it is hard to envision Colin Powell in this role as well. And I think, these cartoons point to policy critiques, people not trusting her and that kind of thing. But I also think they're she's driving the bus of cooking here, right? She's the one holding the cookbook. And I think these representations of her in the kitchen are designed to, in a somewhat contradictory and a fashion that has lots of tension embedded in it, show her as out of place in the Oval Office and as the decision maker for foreign policy. Here she's making rice pudding full of spin and finger pointing and amnesia. And here she is serving the head of the CIA up. This was a larger scandal, of course, but I think it's, again, worth noting that, she is wearing a lacy apron with her name embroidered on it here. So the third theme then is the theme of her sexualization. And like I said, people make a big deal of this, but it's not as represented in the data set as I noted, but we see her, best breasts bared, Liberty leading the people here, and George Bush sort of hapless beside her in his cowboy fit here. We also see her, again, dancing in her Theater of the Absurd fan dance here, where we are supposed to, again, be understanding her as a duplicitous figure. And we don't obviously see her body sexualized here. And in fact, the caption says, sure leaves a lot to the imagination. But again, seeing her in sexualized roles here. And again, we see her as the cheerleader here. We see her as a hooker hailing a ride. This was after a speech she delivered to the Organization of American States. We see her as a child, which again suggests to us that she is incompetent, that she is outclassed. And so, these representations of her compared to Colin Powell as the dignified statesman are really quite stark here. And again, see her that way in her interactions with the Canadian Prime Minister here. And this relates to a situation and scandal as well. Okay, here we go. So let's talk about racism. This cartoon comes up in every single study of the representations of Condoleezza Rice. Here she is in the role of Prissy, the mammy figure in Gone with the Wind. And she's mimicking lines that were said by this character in Gone with the Wind. And again, as a reminder, the mammy figure is an asexual figure that's here to serve white people, presented as dumb, right? In this quotation, she's not speaking proper English, she's appearing barefoot, and that kind of thing. It's hard to ignore as well the way that these images sort of play up sort of minstrel caricature racist stereotypes that circulated in the early part of the, well, I guess 1800s, 1900s, and that kind of thing. We see the Black woman with the exaggerated lips, and you saw that already on a lot of the cartoons that I've showed you. We also see her in sort of menacing and ape-like fashion in a lot of these cartoons as well. And I'll just go really quickly here. But again, we see the exaggerated lips, the menacing, dangerous face. This one comes from Trinidad. So quickly, just to point to some conclusions here. Gender and race are obviously intertwined in these cartoons. This is perhaps not a shocking, I don't know that I've told you anything you don't already know, because these cartoons do all of the things that we expect political cartoons to do. They call out her incompetence. They show her to be untrustworthy, with the fun added tinge of racism here. And so we see, again, the elements of the gender double bind, which is very prominent facing women in power. You're either feminine or you're masculine and you're a threat and that kind of thing, which is a very challenging place to maneuver around. Future research, I hope to look a little bit more at some comparative studies and to study perhaps representations of Colin Powell against Condoleezza Rice, and maybe even look at Hillary Clinton as well. But so again, key takeaway, we're seeing gender and race intertwine in a way that plays up or undermines rather the credibility and trust that we are supposed to see in her powerful role as Secretary of State. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jenny. We now continue with Hendrik Michael from Wuerzburg.
Right, thanks, Martin. Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me. I want to talk to you about my research on the framing of feminist foreign policy in German media. And feminist foreign policy, probably as a concept, dates back to the earliest 20th century, first feminist wave, peace movement, League of Nations, but really came into, this vision was really implemented first through Mexico, Sweden, Canada, late 90s, early aughts, and finally also by Germany in 2023 as basically the paradigm of handling international relations. So what's feminist foreign policy? Basically, it's built up on 3 R's. So ensure equal opportunities and address areas where rights are not implemented, rights of marginalized groups, rights of women in foreign countries. So this focus on implementing, addressing lack of rights is very important. The second R is the resources. So put resources in network building and provide gender-sensitive or gender-targeted humanitarian assistance. And the third R is representation. So promote diversity in cooperating organizations and also increase DI measures in the Foreign Service in Germany. So in short, feminist foreign policy affects many fields of actions, from peace to security policy, humanitarian assistance, crisis management, human rights policy, and so on, right? And so the idea behind feminist foreign policy is, and I quote from the guidelines, to implement in the future a feminist reflex that should be reflected in the full spectrum of our foreign policy activities. And just this phrase of the feminist reflex kind of struck me interesting because it's such a strong kind of framing of the vision of feminist foreign policy. So I wondered, how is this actually then covered in the German media? So how is it framed? How is feminist foreign policy framed in the German press media? To answer that question, I was first interested in what topics are salient in the framing. I was interested in whether feminist foreign policy is framed positively or negatively. And finally, I was interested in what framing strategies were used. So the goal of the framing analysis is to shed light on how media narratives shape public perception of policy paradigms. And I'm using media framing theory and qualitative textual analysis to explore, again, the framing strategies, the tone, and the topical salience in different press outlets. So I went about that research building a corpus from a database called Viso. It's not all encompassing, but there's a lot of media articles in there. And what I did is I searched for the keyword feminist foreign policy, but only in the title of articles, period from early 2020 to late 2024. And I searched only national media. This excludes Bild Zeitung, biggest tabloid in Germany, or Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the leading national newspapers, because they are just not in the database. I ended up with 68 articles, and the final corpus consisted of 68 articles because there were some doublets and irrelevant articles. So I worked with 68 articles, basically. And here's a small breakup of the articles by Medium who covered feminist foreign policy. So as you can see here, Die Welt, a conservative German medium, produced most of the articles, followed by Die Zeit, a rather liberal progressive weekly, the Taz, a left-leaning, a left-wing medium, basically, Spiegel, biggest news magazine, FAZ, a rather conservative medium. But you already see that FAZ, Stern, Spiegel to some degree, they didn't have that many articles. By and large, Die Welt and Die Zeit covered most of the issue in the German media. And if we look at that, we can already kind of form a hypothesis, namely that if the Welt covered most of the issue, then we probably have a negative and a very critical framing of feminist foreign policy. But to go through that, I tried to basically develop an analytical grid based on my research questions, and there's no time to go into the theoretical foundations of framing theory, but in short, to frame is to select, right? So this means certain aspects of reality are emphasized in reporting, while others are de-emphasized or left out of the coverage. So my analytical grid work basically functions that are derived from the 3 R's topical dimensions, where I suppose that those will be salient in the text, namely policies, values, and resources. And what you see here is that I grouped these topical dimensions around specific semantic fields. Yeah, so policies relating to the military, security apparatus, humanitarian aid, and diplomacy. Values, personal values, integrity and empathy, human values, universal values, or even ideological values. And finally, resources, the networking stuff, money, social and economic capital involved or referenced. Tonality is clear. Tonality is coded by looking at viewpoint markers, the perspective, evaluative modifiers, adjectives and adverbs, lexical connotations of words used in context. And the framing strategy is basically, I built here on the well-established differentiation between episodic and thematic framing. So thematic framing quickly focuses on collectives, has an impersonal and emotional diction, uses numericals and statistical data, rather than episodic framing that is built on personalization, incident-based reporting, and an emotional perspective. So let's break this up with this analytical grid and go through my findings. So what I found is that the policy frame, by and large, dominates the coverage of feminist foreign policy. That is not surprising, of course, because the policy frame is salient around key events. For instance, the protests in Iran since September 2020, the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the war in Ukraine since February 2022. Yeah. So if we look at the topic of salience, we see a clear dominance of a policy frame in reporting feminist foreign policy. If we look at the tonality, we get an interesting picture, because what we see here is that the most negative framing is, surprise, surprise, in Die Welt. The most positive is in Zeit. But all media, and that's, I think, one of the more interesting findings here, frame feminist foreign policy in a clear, neutral tone. And the neutral tonality of the coverage dominates across all media. And this neutral tone can be explained. First of all, it's in 25 out of 68 articles, so roughly a third. And the neutral tonality produces a less pronounced thematic framing. It doesn't produce episodic framing, it only produces thematic framing, but in a very, again, fuzzy manner. And that is because we have a professional neutral stance that dominates this neutral tonality. We have a journalistic language of distance, we have reporting verbs, we have a passive voice, we have institutional sources, all which are highlighted here in this exemplary quote that clearly shows you how this neutral professional stance is implemented in news media, right? What we also have, though, is we have in headlines a more clear framing, a more critical approach, a more negative tonality that is established through using pull quotes from institutional sources that give this stronger evaluative framing in the headlines. And that is maybe important if we look at how this framing proliferates to other media than just the legacy media, which I analyzed here. A few more details here on tonality. We can see, and again, that is interesting, that we have a negative tonality, but we also have a positive tonality. It's pretty equal, right, in the thematic framing. And if we look at a positive tonality, what we have is an acknowledgement of the benefit of networking and humanitarian aid. As you can see in the box above, that is a quote from the Taz. If we have negative tonality in thematic framing, what we see here is a rejection of anti-militarism, and a rejection of this idea of diplomatic primacy. As we see in some of the quotes from Die Welt, Berlin is naive, it's a political stunt, rearmament is a patriarchal step backwards. Those are some of the quotings we see here for the tonality of thematic framing. If we look at the tonality of the episodic framing, we find more negative frames, but again, what we see here is that episodic framing doesn't even dominate the framing of the issue in German media. But if it appears, we have significantly more negative episodic framing. And if we have episodic framing in a positive tonality, what we have is an emphasis of the authenticity, mostly of Annalena Baerbock, who is then the focus of the coverage as the foreign minister in Germany. That is pretty logical, I think. And then a positive episodic framing emphasizes her authenticity, her integrity, and her empathy to legitimize the efforts of feminist foreign policy. So we have that in some articles. And interestingly, we have one of the most positive tonalities in one article in Die Welt, right? If we have a negative tonality in the episodic framing, it's a negative tonality in the policy and in the value frame. So we focus on Baerbock's supposed dupability, the eliteness, the language, and the missionary role of feminist foreign policy and its primary agents, and their perceived double standard. And this kind of negative episodic framing can then be used also for gendered character attacks, as we see in this larger quote from Welt columnist Klaus Christian Malzahn. Who else could have written something like that, right? Malzahn, horrible. Anyways, so what we see in this quote here, I highlighted it in red, is first of all, start of the quote is an episodic policy frame where the foreign minister, Baerbock, is portrayed as uninformed, not knowledgeable, stupid, one could say, and also very gullible, right? And then the rest of this block quote has an episodic value frame in it where we have a double standard, that words are not deeds, and that Baerbock is acting dishonestly and is lacking integrity by making up a story about a niece who can't transfer money to her grandmother in Russia anymore if we go through with these sanctions. And Malzahn concludes that this is, first of all, not true. Baerbock is lying. And second, it's an unbelievable abuse of feminist rhetoric. Baerbock torpedoed necessary sanctions with 2 fictitious women. So this is a pretty clear attack on Baerbock's character, I say. But again, it's not the most prominent aspect of the framing of feminist foreign policy in German media. The most prominent aspect is the neutral tone and the thematic framing of the coverage. That is pretty, also not destroying this diplomatic vision as one might have suspected. 2 more minutes, right? So what we see here is a framing triad of public communication where journalists mostly adopt and change the frames of elite sources, politicians, NGOs, expert think tanks, for instance, the CFPP, CARE, or politicians or famous feminists, and that the audience responds to. But what we also see, if we go further than the legacy media, is that we have a dark underbelly, so to speak, where far-right publics tap into the more extreme framing in German media, evident in the negative episodic framing I showed examples of, or in the headlines, for instance, as well, because they are more often negative. They are often more negative than the body of text, and most people read the headlines. So this is picked up by opinion leaders and audiences in far-right publics, and we can see that if we scroll the commentaries on Welt Online here, which are by and large very negative and very much only focus on Baerbock's supposed that she's the bad person here. And so the comments are very clearly, even on a neutral article, this is an article with a neutral framing, and the comments are just destroying. And what we also see is that we see cascading effects where far-right media outlets, like, for instance, Julian Reichelt's News, spin the framing already established in more critical stances in legacy media further. And episodic framing is very effective here, especially because it's negative, because it's proliferating effects of selective perception and selective retention that influence the narrative persuasion of these incident-based kind of stories in the news. And it also feeds on the framing in political publics. Here is an example from a plenary debate where the AfD, Peter Bieström, said, "You carry the rights of women like a monstrance in front of you and destabilize countries and erode traditional cultures under the cover of feminism. And you abuse the cause of women to further a globalist agenda." And what we see here is that we have a framing of feminist foreign policy here that goes far beyond what we see in legacy media, because here we have extreme positions and even conspiracy vocabulary in the political arena. And that's also very fruitfully picked up by alternative right publics, whereas the AfD as an institutional source, at least in the period I looked at, almost has no kind of they are not very quoted very often. So to conclude, the framing is focused on policy issues. It's a thematic framing that dominates the coverage, and negative tonality does not dominate the framing of feminist foreign policy in German media. So the neutral tone, as I said, is the result of an institutional bias, professional routines, sourcing practices in the news media. If we have gendered attacks, they are mostly on Annalena Baerbock in a mode of negative episodic framing, where she's portrayed as unprofessional, arrogant, clueless, naive, but vice versa, we also have some examples of positive framing. We have more polarized framing in network publics, and Jezierska actually concludes that agents who promote feminist foreign policy do too little, and that's maybe something we can discuss afterwards. They do too little to frame messaging on social networking sites. They are too focused on these institutional networks to get the framing across to the public. And what we also see is that character attacks dominate the discourse here. Finally, what we have to see here is that institutional communicators seem to fail to frame feminist foreign policy against alternative right-wing media, platforms, and agents. And that is also due to the limited effects of an elite rhetoric that, for instance, Markowitz and Donahue have determined in one of their recent studies. So that is it from me. Thank you for your attention. I was really happy to talk about this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hendrik. The last speaker on this panel is Holger Mölder from the Tallinn University of Technology. Holger, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, okay. Yeah. Okay, fine. So this is always you have to have good relations with technics. But good morning. Happy to be in Washington, D.C. area after a very long time. And I should start from my roots because I'm not, let's say, a gender politics specialist. My roots are international relations, international security studies, and we started to develop a concept with Eric Shiraev, global knowledge warfare, which should explain these changes which are currently taking place. My focus mostly is on the strategic level, therefore, yeah, dealing with these big pictures. But of course, there are aspects which actually emphasize the role of gender, because here we are entering right now to the new world order. It looks like we now know how it ends, but well, I'm using this expression borrowed from the Mel Gibson series of Mad Max series movies world. So this is a totally new one where we are heading, which is we will face several wars. There are trade wars, there are cyber wars, there are capital wars, there are cultural wars, there are also shooting wars. This is a part of the wars. About gender wars, theoretically, it might be possible. So because many of those wars, what we are facing right now, these are kind of imagined wars. So those who have read this George Orwell's 1984, this is pretty much becoming a reality, because in this world, which is based on very strong image building. So it's images mean a lot. And this is also how we call it as a post-truth politics, which is pretty much about this information. But why we use a term global knowledge warfare? Because knowledge is actually which is the goal. This information, cyber, everything, they are just tools. And well, as you see, there is a huge recognition here. Well, there's several politicians and scientists forced here, so that the role of the information in this new starting world order, which might be not the best one, because all which concerns decision making, popular decisions supported by the majority of the people, might be not always the most wise decision. And this is also we have to take in mind if we turn to this the new situation regarding the global knowledge warfare, where, as you see, there are several angles here. Well, this is pretty much psychological warfare. This is also information warfare. This is you will find this influence revisionist practices, so that how to change the knowledge. Cyber is a world where it's operated, and so, and this is very much, it's not this is the last one, but it's still important. So if we take these images, even from this movie industry, we might call it Hollywoodization, so that all these popular images you can very easy to sell to the audience. And this is actually concerns the gender as well. Therefore, we can construct gender wars within global knowledge warfare very well, if we'd like. And this is about the knowledge. And well, as I said, I'm focusing on in my research on political cultures. Pretty much, I will not go deeply here. But what is so at this is pretty much is also building a knowledge, is building a new worlds. So that, well, let's see if we compare these different worldviews of different political cultures related to this. For example, Angela Merkel from Germany, who said in 2014, so that Vladimir Putin seemingly he lives in some other world. And these differences also refer to some extent also to these more masculine approaches and more feminine approaches. Even Angela Merkel is by origin very conservative politician coming from the Conservative Party, but it doesn't matter. Here in this world of political cultures, she represents, let's say, this more liberal or more feminine part of thinking. Well, and what are the dangers of global knowledge warfare? This is which is based on these emotions. Emotions are good tools to get the audience. And if you are promoting fear, it also creates a kind of consolidation. You can just unite the audience if they respect your position. And well, the result might be it will end with irrational response. This is not calculated, this is not the best option, but this is the most popular option. And this is actually the concern here. And so how here you see how it works. So how to change the knowledge, the operationalization of the knowledge. Gender conflict. I don't want to keep it totally away from here. And well, there is a very good fiction book. I'm using fiction also, even I'm actually functioning in a very practical world. But so Robert Mölder, I think in English, it was called the relative factor, which is also tells us about this world ruled by females, where this male have just a second position. This was quite interesting. Well, but sometimes these fictions also, they are becoming true. Well, and this is a strong opposition between masculinity, femininity in international politics. This also leads us identity politics, so that you will be affiliated yourself with other groups, so that you feel yourself as a member of who should just to promote your ideas. And well, there are some examples. For example, this Robert Kagan, this U.S. author about this. Well, it's America presents this strongman culture. Those Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus. So it will. This also refers somehow this robotics, masculinity. And the world of Merkel versus the world of Putin, it represents practically the same. This is a great division between different political types using stereotypes, so that if the audience accepts it, you can go on. And we'll skip some one here. You see one character, so that how this masculine world has been represented. So that, and here this question is actually, so it's the respect, because we are strong. And well, the question here, which also represents different political cultures here, is, well, it's Russia in their actions in Ukraine. Are they wrong or are they bad? Well, it's a wrong. If they are wrong, this is a criminal behavior, and this represents, this is, let's say, this fading liberal institutionalism. But well, if we, of course, even we might take Vladimir Putin as well, it's a bad person. So we don't like him, but with his actions, we accept it. So as the wrong person takes actions, this is also accepting this cultural approach. And this is also describes to somehow this starting Mad Max world. And these policies are forced by alternative and revisionist movements. Well, this is a fate of alternative politics. I have also some cases here, just to pay your attention. This is a famous Silvesternacht on Köln, or New Year's Eve in Cologne, 10 years ago. If you remember, at least, I don't know, maybe in the United States, but in Europe, was very actively spread the image. Well, it was a massive sexual harassment had been taken place. Well, the results, actually, I made some research on that. Well, of course, there were criminal activities, but what was the danger of these, let's say, image building? This is building big narratives. So what the migrants represents a rapist culture. This is also follows alternative right. And well, what is interesting, alternative left also joined, just forcing different aspects of the men represent rapist culture. So it was very strong promotion of this divisive rhetoric, and it looked quite dangerous. And it doesn't decriminalize the issue, but just forcing these identity wars. This is also, that's a case a little bit later, also 10 years ago, following it's about this one 13 years runaway Russian girl who also was claimed having been kidnapped. This is a Lisa case, also from Germany. So it also promoted by Russia very actively against, let's say, this liberal institutionalist world. So that shows that Europe is weak. So it's very often, if we just look these strategic narratives, these are very oriented to a certain changes. And well, it's also, even it was not proved. So these cases was just a girl left and nothing what happened to her later, it was, yeah, justified. But, well, you can use these big narratives. And the final one, this is also demonization of the politicians. Here, actually, this is from my region. Three politicians, this is former Estonian female president, this is Kersti Kaljulaid, who comes actually from the Conservative Party, Isamaa or Fatherland. And there's Kaja Kallas in the center, who is right now is High Representative of EU in Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, but he was a Prime Minister before. So he represents this, let's say, Liberal Party and the centrist party. And there is a Sanna Marin, former Finnish Prime Minister, who was a social democrat. But in this opposition, masculinity versus femininity, they are, let's say, in this femininity side. So that these are people who are not against this, promoted this strongman culture. So that this, even these critiques I will show you here, well, it's coming from alternative right here, which is pretty much related to one family in Estonia. Therefore, this father and son who are the leaders, the Ecre Party or National Conservative Party. So that these critics, as they made that, well, the President Kaljulaid, for example, acted as emotional woman. So that it is also giving, by giving this gender perspective here, also about the Kaja Kallas here, so that is, of course, respected, so to get this high position in Europe. But in Estonia, she was demonized because she represents, let's say, this liberalist, institutionalist world. And so also reference to Sanna Marin, also, of course, she was her job, so it, she was a sales girl, as mentioned here by Ecre leader, so that is giving such a kind of negative images. Everything is about this image building. Therefore, yeah, well, it's the world is changing. Strong images on these different views. So it's alternative politics has its different sides, different sides. So at and well, in researching these issues at the strategic level, so that what changes take place, so that we have to take care. And gender has actually a very powerful image in this composing these oppositions or conflict. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. We're slightly behind schedule, but not too bad. So we got about 10 minutes for Q&A. Who would like to make a comment or ask anything of any of our presenters? Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Do you find that political cartoons as a great rhetorical artifact for these like early aught figures, are they still as relevant in like the digital social media landscape of today?
That's a great question, and I don't have anything other than vibes to go on to answer it. But I do think that the sort of the media ecosystem in which we live now blurs genres. So it's sort of hard to like tell the difference between what we would consider a political cartoon versus just like a meme, right? Now we can argue for the differences in genre. Maybe political cartoons have to be printed in legacy media or something, although of course, you know, right-wing and left-wing media have their own political cartoonists, but we might, for instance, define the genre as being affiliated with some type of publication. But certainly, I think that when we think about what circulates in, erstwhile Twitter and that kind of thing, that we tend to see memes circulate more widely than political cartoons per se. I will say, as I was researching this presentation, I found a lot of funny political cartoons and sad political cartoons about what's happening now. So they certainly still do exist. But in terms of grabbing the share of the attention economy, I think we see sort of the simple meme sort of in your face more than political cartoons these days.
Yes, there's a question here.
Thank you very much. So one question that came to mind, this is more so for the first two panelists. I was wondering if during your research you saw any kind of intersections with like sexuality and gender identity. For instance, I think it'd be interesting looking at like how trans women, such as like Sarah McBride, is being represented now, and if she falls into that like whore, witch, bitch spectrum you were talking about.
Yes, we studied sexual orientation, basically gender identity. I did include in my paper, and we do have incumbent members of U.S. Congress and prominent politicians who openly gay, for example. But definitely it's being exploited. But I think Martijn Icks will discuss it today as well, just as in his presentation. But
Tomorrow.
certainly tomorrow. Tomorrow. So certainly, and this is a important subject, which is basically that we would only begin to explore. But we did this research on that.
One thing I will say too is you do often see, and this came from the research that we did on Kamala Harris, the idea that Kamala Harris is secretly a man and has been a man this whole time comes up in the fringes of the right-wing media. So it's not, taking trans people, but it's a similar, I think, type of fear appeal, like everyone's hiding, we don't know what's real anymore. And so you don't see that a ton, but we definitely did see that when we were researching Kamala Harris.
Yes, thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Also a little comment to Jennifer. Thank you for the cartoons. Cartoons tell us more than words. And when I saw your cartoons, I was remembering a cartoon of the 18th century about Mary Therese, the Archduke of Austria. And she was very powerful at her time. And there were cartoons in those century showing her walking over the landscape of Europe and letting babies fall out of her while walking because she had so many children and tried to marry them to all over European countries, And so this was a very bad cartoon. I remembered when I saw these cartoons. So maybe you can go back in history to the 18th century to see these old cartoons.
Thank you. We have in some of our other research, and actually in the first handbook that we published that came out of our very first conference in 2017, there were some scholars who wrote about cartoons from the 18th century and stuff. And again, very fascinating, people ripping the heads off of babies and all sorts of stuff that you see in those publications. So thank you for that comment.
Yes,
Hi.
go ahead.
Yes, hi. This is a question for Eric and Jennifer too. Sorry to pick on the same people all the time. Would you agree that the more contemporary version of a political cartoon is an AI generated image or video? And if so, how are you anticipating trying to accommodate research for that?
Well, certainly it is seen, and this is debate basically about how we approach them and how we measure. I think sometimes it is shown, so we see definitely it's just AI, definitely ChatGPT. So and I produced myself first one. It's clearly seen as it's just ChatGPT, even though you can make it stylish and most people expect a personality behind the image. So if I see a cartoon and just mass produced by ChatGPT, but if it's John Smith or Robert Kim, the author, I feel more relevance, and because it's personal opinion expressed by individual. If it's AI produced, perhaps people pay less attention. As this is again, it's my feeling. And second, we believe that there are certain core features that's timeless, whether we portray Marie Therese or Catherine II or leaders from 1930s and today's. The core features remain the same, but peripheral features that remain time and culture specific. So that's why probably AI will capture just this is what we will see in the cartoon.
I don't have a good answer for that, because as a rhetorical critic, I believe that social discourse is produced by agents who are making choices and tailoring messages to audiences. Of course, there's a raging debate about the agency of AI happening, but so for me, designing a research project, I would like to filter out images produced by AI. And so, how you gather those images and sort of tracing the circulation as best you can, which is very hard to do, of course, would be and is something that I typically do when I select the images that I study. But it's a sticky wicket, right? Because certainly these things exist and they circulate and they often aren't questioned. But I guess I just as a rhetorical critic, I'm not super interested in studying images that were produced by AI, which of course does not say that they're not important and they're not there. But it's less interesting or engaging to me when I think about building a data set.
Yes.
Sure. Mm.
Sitting in his lap. Those have really strong political content that's oriented, expressing the narrative about the relationship between Putin and Trump. So I wonder, is it really essential that we begin to think about how do you study things like this, especially when you're in a fragmented media environment where we as researchers would have to gain access to close Facebook groups, etc., to really generate that. It seems to me a worthwhile project to consider.
Well, in fact, I did it a week ago, basically asking ChatGPT, draw me a portrait in the style of Caravaggio of Nancy Pelosi looking as a witch. And there was answer, no, we don't do this just because it's impolite. It's we have against policy. I said, look, I will teach my students on that. Oh, in this case, there you go. That's fine. But still, it was me who directed ChatGPT to do that. So it's still me. And why witch? Because I know this most common stereotype about women. So. And people who will just ask LLM models to produce something, they'll use their own stereotypes, expectations. And the poodle remark, Tony Blair was probably champion of being compared to poodle to, George Bush, basically. Tony Blair, Prime Minister of UK a long time ago. But you're right, this is an enormous challenge and it's exciting. Exciting.
Yep. So it's almost time to wrap up this session, but perhaps if I can ask a final question. Holger, in your presentation, you mentioned there's this more like feminine and a more masculine form of politics, or at least that's the way that it's being framed. And it seems like all the female politicians that you mentioned are automatically put in the more feminine camp, even if they tend to be perhaps quite conservative. And looking at Hendrik's paper, that also seems to pertain to Baerbock, who's also put into this more, let's say, feminine category. Is that always the case, or could you be like perhaps a Condoleezza Rice type woman who would be seen as a masculine politician?
Well, yeah, actually, this gender itself, it doesn't matter in this masculinity, femininity opposition. Probably, yeah. Well, I will take maybe opposite examples. So that there is, let's say, feminist or female politicians representing this masculine culture. Of course, there was an example of Italian Prime Minister Meloni, who is very close to it, or Marine Le Pen in France. So there are, because even AFD, there are a lot of female politicians. Even in Estonian, well, they are not playing this major role, but they are representing this, let's say, masculine culture. And also we have, it's a male politician which are on this liberal side. This is just, if it's, of course, appears we are using this sample of Angela Merkel as representing this culture, because she had quite a big influence, and even this is quite her origin is as well as a conservative politician representing this liberal world. There are so many controversies, but it doesn't matter. So this masculine versus feminine, it doesn't necessarily be between genders.
Yep. Okay. Hendrik, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would actually add to that, because I mean, just the praising feminist foreign policy is
using the
misleading
microphone.
and part of the. Oh, sorry. I think you can understand me there. I have a pretty loud voice. So that is already misleading on part of the problem. I think, and Holger and I discussed that yesterday, how you can see it to get out of this gender basically dichotomy is that one of these paradigms focuses more on distinctions between friends and enemies. That's more the Hobbesian culture, where you can bully your enemies into getting what you want. And the other perspective is one that is more in the Kantian tradition, where it's more on dialogue, on communication, and maybe finding a common sense and empathy. So that's how you could maybe frame those paradigms of doing international relations or managing international relations without falling into this feminist, or the reflexes that the term feminism evokes in many people, right? So that's maybe my last 5 cents.
Thanks. We now have about 10 minutes for the coffee break, but please join me in thanking the speakers on the panel.
Thank you.